high average levels of incomes, but the perception is they have nothing to offer to those who work in insecure employment or who rely on food banks maybe or on payday loans. And therefore, the idea is that if you want to help those people in particular, rather than just maximizing some average, some aggregate value, then you need a big and activist state. You need high levels of income redistribution. You need expensive state-funded social services. You need high minimum wages, and so forth. That, at least, was the dominant thinking behind the whole New Labour project, the so-called third way. That was more or less the idea that, yes, you leave the market economy broadly to its own devices. The state does not have to run the steel mills, but you have to have a state structure next to the market economy, an extra market structure, which would deal exclusively with poverty, because the market economy would not do that. So you have to have this superstructure where you employ lots of social workers and collect high levels of taxes and redistribute the money through welfare states. And that is also the dominant thinking among social policy academics. If you study anything related to that, you've got a very high chance that your professor will be thinking along those lines. And of course, that's also the dominant thinking in what is sometimes called the poverty industries. This whole raft of state-subsidized campaign groups like Oxfam and the Child Poverty Action Group, thinking there is free markets left to themselves create high levels of poverty, even if they work for a lot of people, and that therefore there can be no such thing as a free market anti-poverty strategy, because that would be seen as an oxymoron. Poverty is seen as a byproduct of the market. It's created by the market economy. And therefore, an anti-poverty strategy also has to be an anti-market strategy. You can only contain poverty by constraining markets. Now, you may have guessed I don't buy that line of thinking. And the reason for that is simply that I don't buy the whole assumption that a big state, that the government is some sort of institutional Robin Hood that exists exclusively for the benefit of the poorest. That is just not the way politics usually works. In the political process, the people who benefit most, the people who benefit from a large state, are usually those who are simply best able to organize, to form interest groups, and to articulate their interests in an effective way. The people who are able to cause trouble politically. Those are people who benefit from a large state, either in the form of an influential producer group, so think of lobby organizations here, or simply a group of people who share a particular mindset, such as the public health lobby. Those are usually the sort of people who benefit from a large state, from government largesse, because they are better able to articulate their interests and to organize politically. People who are best able to do that will not be the social housing residents in places like Hackney or Tower Hamlets. It will be fairly well-off middle-class people who read The Guardian or The Telegraph. So therefore, what really happens is that we get a whole range of policies dominated and driven by interest groups that are actively harmful to poor people by driving up prices or by closing off entry into markets. And on the other hand, we also then get policies that benefit the poor through, or at least in the short and medium term, through income redistribution. But what happens is this is actually the equivalent of say, turning up the heating in a room to full power, and then opening the windows when it gets too warm in the room. That's why I've written a monograph on that subject, where I simply made the argument that if you want to help the poor, then you should start by not making the problem worse. You should start by reducing all those harmful interventions that make life more difficult for poor people, and then only then look at crude instruments like income redistribution. But start with the more obvious and the more cost-effective stuff. So I'll mention a couple of examples here. The most extreme example, at least in this country, is probably housing policy, the housing market. In Britain, house prices and rents are pretty much the highest in the world, right? And that is simply because we have the most extreme restrictions against new development. We have probably the most restrictive land use planning policy in the world. And that is what constrains housing supply. That's the reason why Britain has been building fewer new homes than any comparable country for at least 30 years, probably longer than that. That is the reason why it's so expensive to find anywhere to live, not just in London, but actually in the country as a whole. And it's very well established, because there's lots of economic literature on this, that housing costs are mainly determined by land use planning. So the best estimate that I've seen suggested that something like 35% of the average house price can be directly attributed to these anti-development restrictions. And for rents, it's safe to assume that it will be in the same order of magnitude. So if you live in London, if you pay a monthly rent of, let's say, £1,000, you can safely assume that around £400 of that will be a planning policy premium. You pay that just because the government makes it harder to build new homes, and that is the amount by which your rent or mortgage, well, rent in this case, could fall if we adopted a more sensible housing policy that made it easier to build new homes. So that is one of the ways in which the government actively harms poor people, because if you're on a low income, then the impact of that will be especially painful. It's not a problem if you're a well-to-do homeowner, then you actually benefit from this because it pushes up your housing wealth. But if you're a low-income renter, then you pay the price for that policy, and that's an example of what I mentioned. You have the government, on the one hand, driving up housing costs in the first place, and then redistributing income, giving people housing benefits or implicit subsidies in social housing, where it would be much more cost-effective and a lot smarter to just stop causing this problem in the first place, rather than causing it and then throwing money at it with the other hand. So what should be done in this field? Well, first of all, I would abolish crude development restrictions like the green belts in Britain. That is an exceptionally stupid policy, even on its own terms. Even if you want to protect beautiful bits of countryside, that is not the way to go about that, because green belts are simply no development zones. They bear no relation to the quality of that land. That is simply a blanket ban around big cities where nothing gets built, even if it's just agricultural land that has no environmental benefits whatsoever. And more generally, I would also just make sure that the tax system is a lot more decentralized, so that you create tax competition between towns and cities. In the same way as, say, in Switzerland, you get tax competition between cantons and also between municipalities within cantons. And in a system like that, cantons and municipalities try to attract people because they compete for taxpayers. And one easy way of doing that is to allow housing development. Because if you just restrict it, you lose taxpayers, they run away. And something like that would be a solution to that problem, have a much more localized, decentralized tax system. It doesn't even take a perfectly free market if you want to solve that problem. A decentralized tax system would solve most of the problems, even though it is actually possible to leave planning also to the market. City planning is not something that was originally a government function. There are examples of private land use planning mechanisms, either through privately owned communities or system of restrictive covenants. If you go around London, you will see that a lot of the old streets that were built in the 19th century or before, well before the Town and Country Planning Act, are actually quite well ordered, well structured. And that is because there was some landowner who sold off the individual parcels, the individual places where the individual homes would be built, but who retained some residual rights and who told people, look, if you want to build here, you have to use a specific material or a certain minimum height or whatever. And that's simply the reason why private planning doesn't mean shanty towns like in South Africa. When you get that chaotic development, that's usually because you have simply an absence of property rights. You have land that doesn't really belong to anybody. That's when you get shantytown development. But if you have clearly assigned property rights, then planning can be a market function. You can get private planning agencies that compete with each other in a market process. So housing, the biggest issue, at least here in this country. Then another area is agriculture. In particular, here the European Common Agricultural Policy, which is a set of agricultural tariffs and import quotas, and also domestic production limits and minimum prices. That drives up the cost of food. That's the reason why food prices in the EU are about a fifth above world market levels. And again, that's a policy which has no sensible economic justification. That's simply driven by interest groups, the farming lobby in this particular case. And the way to solve that issue would be to do what New Zealand did in the early 1980s. They once had an agricultural sector that was even more fiercely protected than European agriculture. Their agricultural model was initially even worse than the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU. But they simply opened up their agriculture, that sector, to the world market fairly rapidly. And it turned out farmers actually adapted to competition once they were exposed to global competition and could no longer hide. And that's the reason why nowadays supermarkets are flooded with New Zealand wines. That is a result of that liberalization policy. The farmers have to move into more productive avenues where they had a comparative advantage. And in places like New Zealand and Australia, food prices are pretty much exactly equal to world market prices. So there's no markup, no restrictions. And that would be also a much smarter way to help poor people than to give them more money. Because you have, well, if you cut grocery prices, it doesn't make a big difference to well-off people, but for somebody who spends a big proportion of their household budget on those basic essentials, that does make a big difference. And following up on what I said earlier about land use planning, if you have a restrictive land use planning policy, you do not just drive up house prices and rents, you also drive up business rents, and in that way you drive up prices across the board. So every time you go to a supermarket, when you get your groceries, every time you buy a cup of coffee, a pint of beer, you also pay a premium for that restricted land use planning policy, because they have higher office rents for that reason, and they pass that on to you as a consumer. According to one estimate that I've seen, that is about a fifth of the price of, well, an average bundled, average consumer basket that you would buy at some supermarket or retail outlet. So if you solve that problem, you wouldn't just have much lower rents and much lower house prices, you would also save money every time you go to the supermarket. You get your weekly groceries every time you buy a cup of coffee or a pint of beer. There's a planning premium contained in all of that. If you could solve that problem, that would be a massive help, therefore, for those on the lowest incomes. Another area here is energy markets, especially the fact that most or all European countries now force energy companies to use a certain minimum level of renewable energy. Because renewable energy is more expensive, of course, than conventional energy to generate. Otherwise, you would have to force the companies to source it. You would have to subsidize it otherwise. And again, through energy bills, that is then passed on to final consumers. That is again driving up the cost of living for, well, everybody, but the people who feel it most are those on low incomes. And again, there's knock-on effects. If you drive up the cost of energy artificially, you actually drive up the cost of everything, because the production of almost everything requires some amount of energy. So therefore, liberalizing energy markets would also be a fairly effective way of helping people on low incomes. Because even though the impact of those policies is not that huge, it's between 5% and 20% of energy prices, but nonetheless, it's a bigger share. It explains a bigger share of your energy bill than the profits that the company makes. Profit rates, they're normally all over the news. Everybody talks about how outrageous it is that these energy companies have these massive profits. But profit rates are actually just around 4%. So even if you could persuade them to provide energy without any profit, you wouldn't be able to cut energy costs substantially. So this whole new old Labour, Jeremy Corbyn agenda, renationalize everything. Well, even if they had no impact whatsoever on efficiency, it wouldn't make a big difference to energy prices. That's a myth. The reason why people think that is that these profits are always cited as absolute numbers. If you express something in millions or billions, it always sounds big, but it's not a big proportion of the total turnover. So liberalizing energy markets next to agriculture and land markets, that would be the way to go. And there's many other areas I could go on and on. I just want to mention one final one, which is sin taxes. Big issue here. Those of you who are not from here have probably noticed that yesterday that alcohol is extremely expensive here, tobacco is extremely expensive, and that is because of the overuse of sin taxes. Sin taxes are normally justified by some notion of external costs. The idea is that if you drink too much, if you smoke, you cause extra costs to the health service. Now that isn't actually true, even on its own terms. Actually, the people who cause the highest cost to the health service on a lifetime basis is those who lead a healthy lifestyle, because those people live too long. If you justify in those crude utilitarian terms, you would actually have to subsidize tobacco and subsidize alcohol. But even accepting that logic for a second, you could not justify the level of sin taxes that we currently have. So even if we look at specifically the cost of smoking-related, alcohol-related diseases, and compare that to the tax revenue from sin taxes, even on those narrow terms, you would find that sin taxes are way over the top. They're alcohol and smoke cigarettes pay for those costs many times over. So simply limiting sin taxes to that level of related costs would mean a massive cut in practice. And then most sin taxes are quite regressive, especially tobacco duties, because well, among poorer income quintiles, the proportion of smokers is a lot higher. There are many rich smokers left that has become something of a low-income phenomenon, and therefore that is a particularly regressive kind of tax. So reducing sin taxes, liberalizing food markets, liberalizing energy markets, and above all, liberalizing land use planning so that rents, housing costs, and office rents, business rents come down. That would mean you would create an economy in which the basics of life would be very easily affordable for almost everybody across the board. And once you have an economy like that, it would be very difficult to be destitute. Even if you're on a very low budget, that budget would stretch far. So therefore, you wouldn't need a big welfare state. You could then easily cut welfare spending and recycle that by cutting taxes, perhaps give a specific preference to taxes on low earners, raise income tax thresholds or lower the rates, the starter rate, and you would then also strengthen work incentives. Staying on welfare would make less financial sense because the gap between a low-paid job and living on benefits would become bigger, more people would enter the workforce, and you would therefore get something of a virtuous cycle where you strengthen work incentives by having higher living standards for the low paid, and you then have less welfare spending, which could lead to tax cuts, and again to higher, to stronger work incentives. So you could replace the current mess where we have welfare spending levels almost of Scandinavian proportions and still fairly high levels of poverty. You could replace that with a virtuous circle, and I think that is the case that free market people should make when it comes to poverty. Thank you.
You mentioned earlier briefly about the idea that you could have sort of private planning. I haven't heard so much about that. Could you elaborate?
Yes. Well, private planning is pretty much what you had before the nationalization of development rights. It just means you create certain legal titles, such as you can buy some exclusionary rights that on some piece of land a specific type of development would not be allowed. So you don't have to buy the entire land to keep the development free. You just have to buy the right to exclude that type of development, whatever it is. What happens is if that is a very high barrier, if you want to exclude something that would be profitable, then buying the right to prevent that would be expensive. So you could still have citizens' initiative buying those rights and thereby preventing some forms of development. But unlike in the current system, you would have to pay for that. So this kind of NIMBYism, which at the moment comes for free, you just have to write an angry letter to a councillor or collect signatures, and then they say, okay, we will ban everything because we're afraid of the homeowners here who are protesting. Problem is that in the current system, that kind of NIMBYism comes for free. It doesn't cost anything to write an angry letter. It doesn't cost anything to go to a town hall meeting and say, this is outrageous, you have to stop this. Whereas if you had to pay for that privilege of preventing certain forms of development, then yeah, it would still happen, but at the level that people are prepared to pay for. It would be like, so if you're a homeowner, you have the right to add an extra story. I don't want you to do that. I could approach you and say, how about if I pay you, whatever, if I pay your council tax bill for the next 3 years, but you sign a contract assuring me that you will not build that extra story. That would be sort of a cozier solution. And the private planning regime just makes that a bit more, formalizes that, package it into actual property titles. It would be a bit like intellectual property, where if you buy a DVD, you buy a certain bundle of rights. You can watch the movie, you can play frisbee with this, but you don't have the right to show it somewhere and charge money because you don't own the intellectual property in the movie. So you buy a certain bundle of rights, but other types of rights are not included. And that can apply to land as well. You can buy a plot of land, comes with some rights. You can use it for this purpose, or you can build a family home, where you're not allowed to build a big office block. That would be the way it works. Other questions? Yes?
How do you envisage the kind of more liberal planning system working on a strategic level? You know, for example, motorways, airports.
Well, it's always the trouble. How do you get from here to there? It used to work like that, even in infrastructure in the 19th century. Well, the early railways were privately planned and financed. And but getting back to that system once you've lost it is a bit of a different story. I would go the way of fiscal devolution first. Leave those decisions to some much lower level, and if some of them then want to experiment with private planning, then fine, and they should go for that. So specifically for airports, if the area, the community around the airport could retain most of the tax revenue that is created at the airport, you wouldn't get this level of resistance against airport expansion that we currently have, because people would then realize if we block this, we have to pay higher council taxes or higher, would that be a local income tax or whatever. So you would again have something like a Cozian bargaining system, where you could then also have the airport approaching people, approaching local residents, and tell them, look, if we build this runway, yes, it will be noisier here, but how about if we pay you £100 per month for the next few years? How about if we build a community facility here? And you could then have some sort of local referendum, and where people would then make that kind of trade-off, ask themselves, am I prepared to accept a certain level of noise in return for a monetary compensation, a higher living standard in some way, or do I prefer peace and quiet? And people would make that decision. It would then, those types of expansions would then happen in the places where people are least opposed to noise. One example maybe would be that I don't know details about this, but I read that in France, if you live close to I think a power station, you get most of your electricity for free. So that explains the difference. Here, if you want to build a power station, you immediately get 10,000 NIMBY groups protesting against it. In France, people actually want power stations to be close to them, and that's simply because of the difference in the incentive structure. Yes?
You're talking about, a lot of what you focus on is deregulation, liberalising markets. But to come back to where you started, when you were talking, it's as though you said the political situation is taken as a given. The idea of lobbies, interest groups, that's a sort of physical reality. And so what we've got to do is focus our attention on deregulation, given this political nature. Well, I was just wondering whether you didn't focus completely on deregulation markets, but also look at political reform, the actual reforms that can limit the exposure of policymaking from the various lobbies and various interest groups by the democratization of the system. And so you're saying that sort of based off what we have now, as though what we have now is a democracy, the electoral system, the polyarchy that we have. But if you actually had a political system where it was genuinely democratic decision making, so it was actually citizen juries making decisions, so it wouldn't policymakers who are semi-permanent positions and have perverse incentives to accept deals from lobbies and interest groups. If that weren't the case, and in fact, actually, you had a jury that was sortitions chosen by lot and had to make a decision, they wouldn't be under the influence of such partial interests. It'd be a completely transparent system.
Chosen by lot?
Yeah.
Well,
because elections form selection bias and lead to perverse incentives to be able to win the next election, which means you don't actually do the right thing and you'll cave into certain demands.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't have strong views on what the exact decision-making mechanism should be. I'm just very much in favor of devolution and decentralization. And if some political entity then came up with a solution like that, then I would be happy for them to go on and experiment with that. But I wouldn't want to the center imposing any particular decision-making mechanism. I just think the world should consist of lots of Liechtensteins, lots of small units that compete with each other. Yes.
You said that part of the society who doesn't consume alcohol and tobacco, that they cost our society, in fact, more than those who have to pay the same tax because they go on to live longer lives. But I think the difference is that those who have to pay the same tax, they might go on to live just as long, but our health system will have to pay for their medicines.
Yeah, well, the costs have been compiled. That's an empirical question, and the costs have been compiled for a lifetime basis. I suppose that can happen in some cases, that somebody lives just as long as everyone else, but just with more chronic conditions. But empirically, it is the case that would be cancelled out by others who simply die of a stroke or lung cancer before they can reach the age where they get the expensive diseases. So purely on, if you look at lifetime costs in crude aggregates, that is the way it works on average. Not for every single individual, but if you just look at studies I've seen looked at healthy people who do a lot of exercise and so on, and then a group of obese people and a group of smokers. I don't know how they eliminated overlap or controlled for other factors and so on, but it shows on a lifetime basis, if you live a healthy life, you are very expensive to the taxpayer.
That includes public pensions.
I think that was more narrowly defined, but if If you included pensions, then it would be even an even bigger gap. Yeah. I think in that case it was more narrowly health and social care around it. But yeah, of course.